One thing we're a bit lacking at the moment is just a little bit of optimism about, the future of humanity. In one recent survey, only 7% of British people said they thought the world was becoming a better place. And if you turn on the news, well, it's not that hard to see why people might think it's all doom and gloom.
Russia's new invincible nuclear-powered missile.
Fake news is becoming more advanced and threatening societies around the world.
Scientists say climate change is getting worse.
It turns out that being a pessimist is actually a big mistake because, well, it just doesn't fit the facts. Comparing our lives now to in the past, they've improved by almost every meaningful measure. Huge numbers of people around the world are living longer, safer, more prosperous lives. Compared to someone living just after World War II or even the last few decades, many of us, believe it or not, well, we've never had it so good.
Let's start with one of the most basic measurements, the length of your life. Take the average person born in 1950. Well, they can expect to live for just 50 years, but someone born now can hope to live more than 2 decades longer, to 72. Now, this is partly down to huge advances in medical science, but it's also because the gap between rich and poor countries is getting smaller. That's because people in the poorest countries have gained the most. They can expect to live more than 30 years longer than they could in 1950, which pushes the average up. Now, that doesn't mean everything's great. There's still massive inequality between different parts of the world, and also between rich and poor people in the same country. But extreme poverty, that's defined as having $1.90 a day to live on, that's also becoming rarer. The World Bank estimates that 10% of the world's population live in extreme poverty, compared to more than a third in 1990. Okay, so we're living longer and with more money, but are we healthier? Well, by working together, we've managed to eradicate some of the world's deadliest diseases. Take smallpox, for example. It used to kill millions every year, mostly in developing countries. Now, it's a thing of the past thanks to medical science and huge international cooperation. And doctors think they could soon wipe out many other potentially fatal diseases like polio, measles and rubella. But one thing that's getting worse is obesity. With the rise of junk food and unhealthy diets, it's almost tripled since 1975, and it might continue to get worse in the future.
One key indicator of public health is child mortality. That's the number of babies born but who don't survive the first few years of their life. The tragedy of losing a child, sometimes many children to illness, was simply a fact of life for people all around the world before modern medicine. Now, thankfully, it's becoming rarer.
In most developed countries, child mortality rates for under 5s have fallen by more than 90% since 1950. In the least developed countries, deaths have fallen by more than 80%. This is one of the reasons life expectancy has shot up so much. The more people who die young, the lower the average lifespan. Some people think we're a bit too obsessed with health and safety these days, but tighter rules and regulations have paid off. We're less likely to get killed at work or by a car accident or plane crash than ever before. In the late 1970s, about 1 passenger flight in every 250,000 ended in a fatal accident. Now the chance is around 1 in 4 million. That's 16 times safer. And in Britain, your chances of dying in a road traffic accident have dropped by around 2/3 since the early 80s.
How likely is it that you'll be the victim of a violent crime? Well, look, of course it depends on where you live and loads of other factors, but analysis of historical statistics suggests that, for Europeans at least, this is the safest time to be alive ever.
Criminal court records in England go back to the 1200s, when around 20 people per 100,000 could expect to be violently killed. Now the rate is around 1 in 100,000. Hundreds of historical records tell a similar story right across Europe. A massive long-term decline in homicides since the Middle Ages. Let's be clear, if you want to find bad news about climate change, there is plenty to choose from. The rapid industrialisation of the 20th century was driven by the burning of fossil fuels. Levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have soared and global temperatures have risen. The evidence is undeniable. Satellite images show how the ice around the North Pole is melting year on year and how sea levels are rising by around 1 inch every 8 years. But there are some glimmers of light in the gloom. Carbon emissions in Britain, the US and other advanced economies have been falling over the last 20 years. The world is capable of taking tough action when countries agree on the science and pledge to work together. In 2015, there was another great example of international cooperation when 195 countries signed the Paris Agreement, promising to work together to limit global warming.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President-elect of the United States, Donald John Trump.
2 years later, President Donald Trump of the United States, the country with the second biggest carbon footprint, pulled out of the agreement. And he's just one of a string of populist nationalist leaders who have come to power around the world in recent years. Some commentators fear for the future of democracy itself, amid stories about dark money and how social media manipulation is influencing elections. But if we take the long view, there are good reasons to think the world is making progress. Nearly 60% of countries are democracies, that's a record high, and only 13% are autocracies, a post-war low. Historically high numbers of people, more than 4 billion, that's more than half the population of Earth, now live in countries that hold free and fair elections.
Let's be clear, the world still faces massive challenges. We're a long way from solving climate change or poverty or disease. But if there's one thing history tells us, it's that people are capable of rising to the biggest challenges that once seemed insurmountable when we work together.